Have you ever heard a love story so intense, so chaotic, that it feels more like a legend than real life? Today, we're diving into the tale of Bonnie and Clyde, a story that isn't about fairy tale romance, but about a blazing, destructive passion that set the American heartland on fire. This isn't just a crime story, it's a look into how the people can become a myth, romanticizing chaos and their own inevitable doom. Let's rewind to the 1930s. America was in the grip of the Great Depression. The air was thick with dust, poverty, and desperation. For millions, the American dream had turned into a nightmare. Out of this bleak landscape emerged the figures who would capture the nation's imagination: Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was a bright, petite woman from a poor but respectable family in Texas. She was a poet, a dreamer, and a bit of a romantic. Before meeting Clyde, she was married at 16 to a man who quickly ended up in prison. Bonnie was left working as a waitress, feeling trapped and dreaming of a more exciting life, a life she'd only read about in movie magazines. She wrote poetry that hinted at her yearning for fame and a destiny far from her mundane reality. Then there was Clyde Chestnut Barrow, also from a poor family in Texas. Unlike Bonnie, Clyde's life was already tangled in crime from a young age. He was small in stature, but had a massive chip on his shoulder. He started with petty thefts, stealing chickens and then cars, and quickly graduated to more serious offenses. Life had been hard on him, but it was his time in the brutal Texas prison system, particularly at Eastham Prison Farm, that truly hardened him. The experience was so horrific it changed him forever, filling him with a burning desire for revenge against the law enforcement system. He blamed for his suffering. So, how did these two worlds collide? The story goes that in January 1930, Bonnie met Clyde at a mutual friend's house. She was 19. He was 20. The connection was instant and electric. For Bonnie, Clyde was the embodiment of the excitement and danger she craved. He was her ticket out of a dull life. For Clyde, Bonnie was something else entirely. She saw past his criminal record and saw the man, offering him a loyalty and adoration he'd never known. She wasn't just a partner. She was his devoted audience and his fiercest defender. Shortly after they met, Clyde was arrested and sent back to prison. But this time, Bonnie wasn't going to let him go. In a daring move that cemented her commitment, she smuggled a gun to him in prison, helping him and his cellmates escape. Though he was recaptured shortly after, this act proved her loyalty. Clyde was utterly smitten. From that moment on, they were inseparable in spirit, and once he was paroled in 1932, they became inseparable in reality. This is where the legend of the Barrow Gang truly begins. Along with various accomplices, including Clyde's brother Buck and his wife Blanche, Bonnie and Clyde embarked on a 2-year crime spree that crisscrossed the central United States. They robbed small-town banks, gas stations, and grocery stores. Their hauls were often pitifully small, sometimes just a few dollars. They weren't master criminals like John Dilliner. They were often clumsy, disorganized, and desperate. What made them different? What turned these small-time crooks into folk heroes? A huge part of it was their image, an image they carefully crafted themselves. In 1933, after a shootout with police in Joplin, Missouri, the gang had to flee in a hurry, leaving behind most of their possessions. Among the items police found was a roll of undeveloped film. And this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. The photos on that roll were not what you'd expect from hardened criminals. They showed Bonnie and Clyde in playful, almost theatrical poses. Bonnie, cigar in her mouth, holding a pistol. Clyde, cool and confident, with his arm around his girl. They were mugging for the camera, performing for an imaginary audience. When these photos hit the newspapers, they went viral, 1930s style. Suddenly, Bonnie and Clyde weren't just faceless thugs. They were characters. They were young, they were in love, and they were rebels defying a system that many people felt had failed them. In the midst of the Great Depression, when banks were foreclosing on family farms and people felt powerless, here was a couple who fought back. They were seen as modern-day Robin Hoods, even though they never gave money to the poor. The public projected their own frustrations onto them, romanticizing their crimes as acts of rebellion. Bonnie was central to this myth. In an era when women were expected to be demure and domestic, she was a gun-toting outlaw. Her poetry, which sometimes found its way into the papers, added another layer to her persona. She wrote about their life on the run and predicted their violent end. One of her most famous poems, The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, ends with the lines, "Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To a few, it'll be grief, to the law, a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde." She was a poet who knew her story needed a tragic ending. This self-awareness, this romantic fatalism was captivating. She wasn't just a criminal, she was the author of her own legend. But let's be clear, the reality of their lives was anything but romantic. They lived in constant fear, always on the move. They slept in stolen cars and ate cold food. They were often wounded and in pain. A car accident left Bonnie with a severe leg burn that never properly healed, causing her to be carried by Clyde for the rest of her short life. The glamour of the photographs was a complete illusion. Their life was a grim, desperate flight from justice, and it was a violent one. While they are often romanticized, it's crucial to remember that their actions had deadly consequences. The Barrow Gang is believed to be responsible for the deaths of at least 9 police officers and several civilians. They were not gentle rebels, they were killers. The public's fascination often overlooked the trail of blood they left behind. They were celebrated for their audacity, but that audacity came at a terrible cost to their victims and their families. As their notoriety grew, so did the efforts to capture them. The manhunt was relentless. Led by legendary Texas Ranger Frank Hammer, a determined posse of lawmen began to close in. Hammer was a tough, old-school officer who studied the gang's movements, their habits, and their connections. He knew they were predictable, often returning to familiar areas. To visit family. This weakness for family would be their undoing. Hammer learned that the gang was planning to visit the family of one of their members, Henry Methvin, in Louisiana. He set up an ambush. On the morning of May 23, 1934, on a quiet rural road near Gippsland, Louisiana, the story reached its violent, inevitable conclusion. As Clyde drove their Ford V8 down the road, the posse of 6 officers opened fire without warning. There was no freeze or surrender. There was only the deafening roar of over 130 rounds of ammunition tearing through the car and its occupants. The ambush was brutal and absolute. Bonnie Parker was 23. Clyde Barrow was 25. In their death car, police found an arsenal of weapons, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and a saxophone that Clyde played. They also found one of Bonnie's poems. The aftermath was a media frenzy. Souvenir hunters descended on the scene, trying to grab pieces of the car, shell casings, and even snippets of their blood-soaked clothing. The public's macabre fascination continued even after their deaths. Their desire for a piece of the legend, a tangible connection to the myth, was insatiable. Bonnie had wished to be buried side by side with Clyde, but her family refused. They were buried in separate cemeteries in Dallas. Yet, even in separation, their story remained intertwined forever. So, why are we still so fascinated by Bonnie and Clyde nearly a century later? It's because their story taps into something deep within us, the allure of the outlaw, the romance of rebellion, and the power of a love story, no matter how twisted. They represent a fantasy of ultimate freedom, living by your own rules, loyal only to each other, against the entire world. Their story is a powerful reminder of how media can shape perception. The photographs they left behind created a legend that was far more glamorous than the gritty, painful reality of their lives. They were experts at personal branding before the term even existed. They romanticized their own chaos, and the public eagerly bought into it. But the legend of Bonnie and Clyde is also a cautionary tale. It shows how easily we can confuse notoriety with greatness, and how the romance of rebellion can mask the ugly truth of violence and its consequences. They were not heroes. They were desperate people who made terrible choices, leaving a trail of grief in their wake. Their love story wasn't one of salvation, but of mutual destruction. They didn't save each other from their demons. They fed them. In the end, their story is a complex tapestry of love, crime, poverty, and fame. It's a dark American fairy tale where the prince and princess are armed robbers, the castle is a stolen car, and the happy ending is a hail of bullets. The romantic image of Bonnie and Clyde, young lovers on the run, will probably endure forever. But it's essential to look past the myth and remember the real, tragic story of the lost souls who chose a path of chaos and death, and in doing so, became immortal. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the most compelling stories from history. See you next time.